Sarah always trusted logic, not feelings. But the evening she felt an invisible weight pressing down in her apartment, logic failed her. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the faint sounds she couldn't place, it was something deeper, primal. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but from what? And why now? What she didn't know was that ignoring her intuition would put her at the center of a mystery that had claimed lives before and wasn't done yet. It was an ordinary evening when Sarah sat down in her apartment, the glow of the television flickering in the dim light. She had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to unwinding. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of stillness that felt too perfect, as though the world had paused for just a moment. And yet, for some reason, Sarah felt uneasy. She tried to shake off the discomfort, convincing herself that it was simply the exhaustion talking. But as she sat on the couch, something seemed to pull at the edges of her mind. It was as if her senses were heightened, though there was nothing she could see or hear that explained the feeling. The room felt oddly heavy, a tension in the air that she couldn't place. It was almost as though someone was watching her. She stood up abruptly, pacing around the apartment. There were no signs of intrusion, no strange noises, nothing out of the ordinary. But the feeling persisted. She looked out the window, hoping the cool breeze from the city streets would clear her head, but it did nothing to ease her unease. A sudden noise from the kitchen made her jump. It was faint, but unmistakable, a soft sound of something shifting on the counter. Sarah slowly walked into the kitchen, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. The room was as it had been before, clean, organized, nothing out of place. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her phone rang and the vibration startled her. The caller ID was unknown, and instinctively she hesitated. She wasn't the type to answer calls from numbers she didn't recognize. But this time something compelled her to pick it up. The voice on the other end was muffled, the line crackling with static. "Is anyone there?" the voice asked. Sarah's hand trembled as she held the phone to her ear. The line went dead before she could respond. The sensation grew stronger, more overwhelming. Her body was telling her something, and for the first time she began to listen. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just in her mind. She didn't know how, but she knew it deep down. Days passed, but the sense of dread that had settled in Sarah's bones didn't fade. She had never been one to trust vague feelings, but the unease had grown so persistent that she began to question everything around her. It wasn't just the apartment anymore, it was the world itself that felt off. There was a constant, nagging feeling of being watched, as if someone or something was always just behind her, ready to pounce. It was early morning when Sarah's intuition took on a new form. As she walked to work, the usual route she took felt different. The street seemed darker, the buildings looming taller than usual. The people walking by all appeared to move with an eerie sense of purpose, their eyes never meeting hers. She caught a glimpse of a man across the street, his face half covered by a hat, but for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her every move. She quickened her pace, but the feeling of being pursued didn't fade. It was as if her steps were being mirrored, every movement watched, calculated. She glanced behind her once more but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the sensation was undeniable. There was no reason for it. She hadn't seen the man follow her, hadn't heard anything unusual, but it was there. At work, Sarah's concentration faltered. She found herself distracted, her mind wandering to the growing sense of foreboding. Her co-workers noticed her unease, but she dismissed their concern. She wasn't sure how to explain it herself. Then the phone call came again. The same muffled voice, the same crackling line. She didn't pick up this time, but the message was clear. Someone knew she was listening. After work, Sarah decided to visit a local cafe to clear her head. She had barely stepped inside when a sudden chill washed over her. The air felt colder than it should have, and the room seemed too quiet. The barista greeted her, but Sarah's attention was caught by the figure sitting at the far end of the cafe. He was the same man she had seen earlier in the morning, the one she thought had been following her. This time he didn't look away when their eyes met. Instead, he gave a subtle nod, a gesture so small yet so deliberate that it sent a jolt of fear through Sarah. The tension was unbearable. She quickly turned away, rushing out of the cafe without another glance. That night, as she lay in bed, the unsettling feeling persisted. She knew one thing for certain: her intuition was trying to tell her something, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Over the following weeks, Sarah's intuition became an ever-present force in her life. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Every corner seemed to hide someone. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. It was as though the world around her had suddenly shifted, and she was the only one who could feel it. It wasn't just the man from the cafe, it was the sensation that something was closing in on her. The strange phone calls continued, growing more frequent. Each time the voice remained the same, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. Sometimes it whispered her name. Other times it simply stayed silent. Sarah tried to shake off the paranoia. She spoke to friends, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but no one could understand. Her unease was becoming more consuming, and every night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when it would end or if it ever would. One evening, after receiving another strange call, Sarah decided to confront whatever was causing the unease. She walked around her apartment building, carefully checking every corner, every hallway. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. She couldn't explain why, but she knew that this was the moment when things would either make sense or spiral completely out of control. The hallway seemed darker than usual. The buzzing of the overhead lights sounded unnervingly loud. She paused in front of her neighbor's door and heard a faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the other side. Her heart pounded in her chest. Should she knock? Should she call for help? But what would she even say? Suddenly the door swung open, and Sarah found herself face to face with a woman she had never seen before. She was standing there, looking at Sarah with an almost knowing expression, as though she had been expecting her. "I think it's time you trusted yourself," the woman said, though her words seemed distant, as if they were meant for someone else. Before Sarah could respond, the door slammed shut. She stood there in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was then that Sarah understood. The feeling, the whispers, the constant sense of dread, it had all been guiding her to this point. Her intuition had led her here, to this moment, and she finally realized that she wasn't alone. The answer she had been seeking had always been right in front of her. The woman's cryptic words haunted Sarah long after their encounter. She couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger knew something that Sarah herself didn't. Something crucial. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah began researching the building's history. What she found startled her. The building, once a bustling apartment complex, had a dark past. Years ago, there had been a series of mysterious disappearances, with tenants vanishing without a trace. The police had investigated, but no answers had been found. It was as though the people who disappeared had simply evaporated, leaving no evidence behind. Sarah dug deeper, contacting former residents and trying to piece together the fragments of a story no one seemed willing to share. It was then that she stumbled upon an old news article about a woman who had lived in the very apartment Sarah now called home. The woman had been one of the disappearances, but her body had never been found. The article mentioned that the woman had been plagued by strange sensations in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, feelings of being watched, of being followed. It was eerily similar to what Sarah had been experiencing. The pieces clicked into place. The building wasn't just a place of residence, it was a trap. An unseen force had been guiding Sarah, leading her down the same path as those who had disappeared before her. With the truth revealed, Sarah faced a decision. She could flee, leaving everything behind, or she could stay and confront the unknown. The fear of disappearing like the others weighed heavily on her, but the idea of running felt equally oppressive. Wherever she went, this force might follow. One night, Sarah packed a small bag, her heart pounding with every movement. She wasn't entirely sure where she would go, but the urgency in her intuition left no room for hesitation. The ordeal leaves Sarah shaken but resolute. She reflects on how her intuition, dismissed so often as paranoia, was the key to uncovering the truth and saving herself. Your intuition isn't just a feeling, it's your first line of defense.